Many assume the Brexit question was settled forever back in 2016 when 17.4 million Britons voted to leave the European Union. But the establishment in Westminster is now openly conceding what many ordinary voters have been saying for years. Public support for rejoining the EU keeps on climbing, with young people especially in favour. Prime Minister Keir Starmer himself has now admitted that British GDP per capita is running lower than it would have been inside the bloc, business investment is down, and total trade volumes have collapsed by roughly 15%. And just last week, the OECD slashed its UK growth forecast for next year. So today, we break down whether Britain can realistically rejoin the EU before the decade is out, what Starmer is doing behind the scenes that critics are calling rejoin by stealth, and why the surge of Reform UK in the polls suggests this argument is going to define British politics for the next 10 years. My name is Guy, and this is Coin Bureau Finance. Now, to understand why this debate has come roaring back to life, let's start with the scale of the polling shift that has occurred over the last 12 months alone. According to YouGov, 63% of voters now want the UK to rejoin the EU, while among voters under 25, that number climbs to 86%, a generational supermajority that has not been seen on any major constitutional question in recent British history. Even among 2016 Leave voters, a meaningful number now tell pollsters they would change their vote if asked again. And the only major voting bloc where Rejoin support stays in the minority is among Reform UK supporters, where backing for re-entry sits at just 18%. And the economic data the Prime Minister is now citing in his own speeches has done more to legitimise this shift than any opposition campaign could have managed. Starmer's admission that GDP per capita is running 6 to 8% below the counterfactual is drawn directly from the Office for Budget Responsibility's March 2025 analysis, which estimated that Brexit will reduce long-run UK productivity by around 4% and total trade by approximately 15% relative to remaining inside the bloc. The Food and Drink Federation reports that food export volumes to the EU in 2025 were 31% lower than they were in 2019. Meanwhile, the new EU entry-exit system, which went live on the 10th of April this year, has introduced biometric registration for British passport holders at every external EU border, generating airport queues so painful that Greece has unilaterally exempted UK travellers just to relieve the congestion. For ordinary holidaymakers, the friction is now physical, visible, and deeply unpopular. And this begs the question, if the Prime Minister himself is now admitting the economic damage, and if the public mood has flipped this decisively, why is nobody in Downing Street actually moving towards rejoining the EU? Well, the answer exposes the most ruthlessly pragmatic piece of political triangulation any British government has attempted in a generation. Because Starmer is not pursuing rejoining. He's pursuing something far more ambitious and far harder for the public to actually see. On the 15th of April this year, the UK and the European Commission formally signed the legal text of the Erasmus Plus participation agreement in Brussels, with British students set to begin participating again from the 2027 to 2028 academic year. The first-year cost to the British taxpayer is £570 million, which the government claims represents a 30% discount on the standard participation rate, although that figure is projected to rise to roughly £815 million per year once the initial concession phases out. For comparison, the Turing scheme that replaced Erasmus after Brexit cost approximately £110 million annually, meaning the new commitment represents more than a five-fold increase on the budget of its domestic predecessor. Ursula von der Leyen described the agreement as a step that would, quote, bring London closer to the Union. And, critically, the deal was finalised without a parliamentary debate or a vote. But the Erasmus deal is just the warm-up act for what's coming on the 13th of May, when the King's Speech is expected to introduce what officials are informally calling the UK-EU Reset Bill. This piece of legislation will grant ministers what constitutional lawyers refer to as Henry VIII powers, allowing them to align UK regulations with evolving EU standards through secondary legislation, without requiring a full parliamentary vote on each individual rule change. The sectors covered are extraordinary in their economic scope. Agriculture and food safety standards, the energy sector including a potential link to the EU's internal electricity market, steel, electric vehicles, the chemicals industry, and pharmaceuticals. Now, the government argues this framework will be worth as much as £5.1 billion annually to the UK food and drink trade alone through reduced border friction. But of course, it's important to read the fine print here. By aligning UK rules with European regulations through statutory instruments, the British government is committing the country to follow Brussels law as it evolves over time, without holding any vote, any veto, or any seat at the table where those rules are actually written. Lord Frost, the Conservative peer who negotiated the original Brexit Trade and Cooperation Agreement, has labelled this arrangement rule-taking without representation, a phrase that Reform UK and constitutional scholars across the political spectrum have rapidly adopted. Professor Anand Menon of UK in a Changing Europe has argued publicly that regulatory shifts of this magnitude should be subject to full parliamentary debate rather than enacted through secondary instruments that Parliament can approve or reject but cannot amend. And there's a particularly sharp irony embedded in all of this. Starmer himself, when sitting on the opposition benches, was a vocal critic of Henry VIII powers, arguing that they bypassed parliamentary scrutiny and undermined democratic accountability. Deploying that same constitutional mechanism to implement European regulatory alignment is a contradiction his opponents are now weaponizing relentlessly. And to make the picture even more uncomfortable, the European Union has been remarkably clear about what genuine reaccession would actually involve, and the terms are nothing like the bespoke arrangement Britain enjoyed before 2020. The historic budget rebate negotiated by Margaret Thatcher in 1984, which reduced the UK's net contribution to Brussels by billions of pounds annually, would simply not be available to a rejoining Britain under any current accession framework. And under the standard Copenhagen criteria, new member states are required to commit to adopting the euro as their currency, meaning the historic British opt-out from the single currency would not transfer to a fresh application. Similarly, the carve-out from the Schengen area that allowed the UK to maintain its own border controls was a pre-Lisbon Treaty special arrangement that would not be replicated under any new accession agreement. And the country would need to accept the entirety of European law accumulated since the day it left the bloc. So, put simply, if Britain ever did rejoin, it would be doing so on substantially worse financial and political terms than it had as a founding-era member. Now, on the other side of this argument, the organised Brexiteer response has been gathering momentum at the same pace. Lord Frost, Sir Bill Cash, Baroness Hoey and Lord Redwood are organising a major conference for next month dedicated to resisting the reset agenda and challenging the official narrative on Brexit's economic damage. And their statistical counterargument deserves to be presented fairly because it does point to a genuine measurement problem. Analysis cited by groups such as Facts for EU and Briefings for Britain claims that UK exports to the EU are now around 18% higher in nominal terms than they were in 2015. The Brexiteer case argues that the structural problems facing British industry today are driven by net zero energy costs, which have left wholesale prices roughly 35% above pre-crisis levels, and by the inflationary shock from the Iran conflict, which has pushed Brent crude back into the high 90s of dollars per barrel. But the methodology gap here is critical to understand. The 18% nominal export figure is not adjusted for inflation, includes services as well as goods, and benchmarks against a 2015 baseline rather than the immediate pre-departure comparison. The House of Commons Library, by contrast, reports that real terms goods exports to the EU are 18% below their 2019 level. Now, both figures can be simultaneously true because they measure entirely different things, and the truth almost certainly sits in the structural decline of the EU's share of total UK exports, which has fallen from 44.5% in 2014 to 41.2% in 2024. Now, the geopolitical and market consequences of all this rule-taking are reshaping the British political economy in ways that almost nobody is properly pricing in real time. And if you want to stay informed about how these constitutional and economic fault lines are translating into market structure, then you should be reading the Coin Bureau Finance weekly newsletter. It's absolutely free, and we break down everything regarding global finance, geopolitical realignment, macroeconomic trends, and monetary policy so that you never miss what truly matters. All you have to do is click the link in the description below or scan this QR code on your screen. And now, back to the political reality that's making this entire reset agenda extraordinarily fragile. Because while Starmer pursues regulatory alignment with Brussels through secondary legislation, the political ground beneath his feet is shifting with genuinely unprecedented speed. Reform UK, the party led by Nigel Farage, is currently polling at 27% nationally according to YouGov's most recent survey, holding a 10-point lead over its nearest rival. The More in Common multi-level regression model is projecting Reform to gain somewhere between 1,273 and 1,603 council seats in the local elections being held on the 7th of May, with Labour meanwhile projected to lose between 1,500 and 1,800 of the seats it is currently defending. In Scotland, the same modelling places Reform as the second largest party in the Holyrood Parliament, with 22 projected seats. In Wales, one YouGov and Cardiff University projection actually has Reform winning 37 seats and potentially becoming the largest party in the chamber, narrowly ahead of Nationalist Party Plaid Cymru. And the political logic this creates for Starmer is almost impossible to navigate. Every step his government takes towards the EU, whether the Erasmus signing without a parliamentary vote, the dynamic alignment legislation through Henry VIII powers, or the SPS deals being struck in Brussels, feeds directly into the Reform narrative that the establishment is relitigating Brexit by stealth. Farage has publicly described Starmer's reset as, quote, a total betrayal of the Brexit vote and a complete breach of the Labour manifesto, vowing to oppose the forthcoming reset bill at every step of the parliamentary process. And the situation is being radically intensified by the simultaneous breakdown of the transatlantic alliance that has anchored British foreign policy for 80 years. When Starmer publicly refused to back the United States and Israeli military campaign against Iran, telling the House of Commons that Britain is, quote, not getting dragged into the war, President Trump did not take it well. Trump has threatened to rip up or change the US-UK trade deal that was signed back in May 2025, describing the special relationship as being in a, quote, sad state. And when asked directly which special relationship he was referring to, his response was simply, quote, with who? And Britain is now being forced to co-host a multinational summit with France involving more than 30 countries on reopening the Strait of Hormuz, pointedly excluding the United States from the planning stage. Meanwhile, a House of Lords committee report this month formally warned that the UK can no longer assume that the United States will guarantee European security. And this is the deeper reason the EU reset is happening at all. The British government is being squeezed between an unpredictable American administration that has openly threatened the trade relationship and an enormous European economic bloc whose regulatory standards Britain will need to align with simply to maintain market access during a global crisis. Now, sitting underneath all of this is the Mandelson security vetting scandal, which has detonated under Starmer's leadership in the most damaging possible way. Peter Mandelson was appointed as British ambassador to the United States in December 2024, specifically to manage the incoming Trump administration. UK security vetting formally recommended on the 28th of January 2025 that Mandelson should be denied developed vetting clearance, the highest level of British government security access, citing concerns related to his documented connections to Jeffrey Epstein, Russia, and China. That recommendation was overruled by the Foreign Office Permanent Secretary, Ollie Robbins, who granted clearance regardless and allowed the appointment to proceed. Mandelson was then sacked as ambassador in September 2025 following press revelations about his Epstein relationship. The vetting failure itself only became public on the 16th of April this year, and Robbins was fired by Starmer within 24 hours of the news breaking. 5 days later, Robbins testified before the Foreign Affairs Select Committee that he had faced constant pressure from Downing Street to expedite the appointment and that the risks associated with Mandelson had been made clear to the Prime Minister well before his appointment was confirmed. Prediction markets, including Polymarket and Kalshi, are now pricing the probability of Starmer remaining Prime Minister through to September 2026 at approximately 50-50, while William Hill is offering odds equivalent to a roughly 78% chance that he leaves the Labour leadership before the year is out. And this creates what is genuinely the central paradox of the entire EU reset agenda. The very political instability that makes deeper European integration economically urgent is also making it politically impossible to deliver in any durable form. A Labour leader who may not survive the autumn cannot credibly commit Britain to a multi-year regulatory alignment programme. Any successor pushed forward by a post-local election crisis would face immediate pressure from a resurgent Reform UK and from the Labour right to abandon or substantially dilute the entire project. So, the window for meaningful European realignment may actually be narrowing at exactly the moment public support for it is reaching its highest level on record. The reality is that the UK is caught between three forces that cannot be easily reconciled. The era of comfortable transatlantic certainty is over, replaced by an American administration that openly questions the value of the alliance. The era of clean Brexit divergence is also over, replaced by a quiet regulatory alignment programme that imports European rules without any British vote on what they should say. And the era of two-party British politics is dissolving in real time, replaced by a fragmented landscape wherein reform is reshaping every electoral calculation in England, Scotland, and Wales simultaneously. Genuine reaccession to the EU within this decade is almost certainly not realistic, given both the political fragility in Westminster and the substantially worse terms Brussels would impose on any returning member state. What is far more likely is the slow consolidation of a partial alignment model in which Britain follows European rules in agriculture, energy, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and food safety, while ruling out any return to the single market, the customs union, or freedom of movement. A lot has changed since 2016, and the appetite is there for Britain to rejoin the EU and consign the last decade to history. But, as with almost everything in politics, that is going to be much easier said than done. But what do you think? Will the UK end up back in the EU, or will the rise of reform put a stop to the idea? Unleash those opinions in the comments below. And if you want to understand how the breakdown of the transatlantic alliance is permanently repricing global energy and defence markets heading into 2027, then check out that video right over here. Okay, that's all from me for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon. This is Guy, signing off.